Is Austria disbanding its military? What's the deal with Donald Trump's desire to pull several thousand American troops out of Germany? Military matters these days are greeted by the majority of the population most of the time with but a shrug. But what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economics Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and this week we'll be taking a look at Hayek and the military. Okay, so to set the record straight, no, Austria is not disbanding its army. It was a rather infelicitous misunderstanding on the part of the Minister of Defense. So that's cleared up. But the Austria of Hayek's time was a very different Austria from the one today. It's kind of amusing that such a misunderstanding could happen in today's neutral Austria, because but 100 years ago, Austria was somewhat more belligerent than it is today. Indeed, it played a capital role in the outbreak of the First World War and made its fair contribution to the Second World War as well. That was the Austria of Hayek's day, an Austria that was much larger than the Austria that we know today, the small, beautiful Alpine Republic of today. Back then, you still had the Habsburg Empire, for example. So what was Hayek's views then on military and war? Well, growing up, Hayek's family actually supported the First World War. And this was something that was not uncommon. I mean, even a very young Karl Popper was caught up in the enthusiasm. And frankly, why not? Because the prevailing attitude at the time was that the soldiers who were off to war in the fall would be back by Christmas. And in some respects, that's perhaps one of the many great tragedies of the First World War. No one who marched off into the trenches in 1914 had any living experience of the last great European conflagration that tore the continent asunder, namely the Napoleonic Wars, which were concluded by the Congress of Vienna in 1815. It had been more or less a solid century without any mass multi-country interstate warfare, with the possible exception of the Crimean War. And perhaps that's the tragedy of the Congress of Vienna. It was such a successful arrangement that the generation that would end up going off to war in 1914 would have no clue of the horrors that that arrangement was meant to prevent. Sadly, the Treaty of Versailles, which was concluded after the First World War, was not as wisely concluded as the Congress of Vienna. In any case, so Hayek, though, was also partook in the First World War. He joined the army in March 1917, just shy of his 18th birthday. He was in Italy for about a year, so until the end of the war in November 1918. And he had many exciting experiences as well in the First World War. For one, part of his skull was chipped away by ricocheting shrapnel at one point. He would parachute out of observation balloons, and he got into dogfights with Italian planes. But excitement was the exception. In fact, excitement punctuated a great many boring moments. And one of the curious facts about Hayek's life is that it was precisely in some of these boring moments that he decided to start reading about economics. So, we'll discuss war and its relation to socialism, as well as Hayek's thoughts on military organization of society in a different video. Right now, I just want to concern myself with a much more modest issue. What does Hayek think about the military as such? Because obviously we know Hayek as a great economist and political philosopher of the 20th century. We know obviously he was in favor of commerce and the market, and used to cite approvingly Montesquieu's phrase that where there is commerce, there are gentle mores. But it must be said he also approved of military conscription. Moreover, he was not naively pacifistic either. There's an interesting interview that he has in early 1983, and I'd like to read a passage to you. This is quoted in Alan Abenstein's biography of Hayek. And so he's asked about arms expenditure in the Reagan administration. And this is what Hayek has to say about that. He says, "I'm convinced Reagan is right not to reduce arms expenditure. World peace depends upon America staying strong. The real problem is whether we have got ourselves into a situation in which the Soviets can intimidate us to such an extent that we knuckle under completely. The West must stay at least as strong as the Soviet Union. I don't believe any Russian is daft enough to start a nuclear war. But if ever the Soviets are in a position to intimidate us with military superiority, they won't hesitate to do whatever they want." It's an interesting passage because there's a lot packed into it. For one, Hayek saw world peace as the goal. Secondly, he saw a clearly defined threat to that very goal, in his case, the Soviet Union. He saw that America needed to be strong in order to restrain its enemy or enemies, as well as to secure world peace. He saw the importance of arms expenditure in maintaining one's strength. And finally, he had no illusions about the good intentions of potential enemy countries. Now, all of these things are things that we who have no living memory of the Great War started in 1914, just like that generation, Hayek's generation, had no living memory of the Napoleonic Wars concluded a century before then. These are all things that we should bear in mind, especially in Europe. Now, Hayek did experience the Great War, and we should be mindful of the experiences of those who came before us. And that's what Hayek would say.